This video is brought to you by Incogni. On Sunday, 3 US service members were killed by a drone attack on a military base near the Syria-Jordan border. According to the White House, the attack was carried out by radical Iran-backed militant groups, and on Sunday evening, US President Joe Biden ominously vowed that we shall respond. This escalation comes literally a few days after the US announced that it was finally planning a full withdrawal from the region, or at least Iraq, where a few thousand US troops are nominally stationed as part of the ongoing but low-intensity fight against ISIS that began in 2014. While Iran has already denied having anything to do with the attacks, a handful of US politicians have already come out in favour of retaliating against Iran, prompting Iran to raise its air defences to their highest readiness level. So in this video, we're going to explain why the US was planning to withdraw from Iraq, what happened on Sunday, and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start by explaining why US troops are currently stationed around Syria and Iraq. For context, the US still has around 900 troops in Kurdish-controlled parts of northeastern Syria, and about 2,500 troops in Iraq, deployed mainly in and around Baghdad. The US has always claimed that these troops, including the ones that were attacked on Sunday, although they were technically in Jordan, are in the region as part of the ongoing fight against ISIS, and that the contingent in Iraq are there at the invitation of the Iraqi government. However, this has always been implausible, mainly because, well, ISIS aren't really a threat anymore. After taking control of about a third of Syria and 40% of Iraq in 2014, by 2018 ISIS had lost about 95% of its previous territory, and today is mostly confined to remote desert areas in western Iraq. While there's a risk that the current regional instability could revive ISIS, as demonstrated by their lethal bombing attack in the Iranian city of Kerman a few weeks ago, this doesn't make the US claim any more plausible, because, well, it's what they've been saying for the past 5 years. The US deployment in the region became particularly controversial in the Trump presidency, especially after the former president gave an astonishing press conference where he said that the US was only in Syria for oil.
We're keeping the oil. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil.
But, well, while it's since become a bit of a talking point in Chinese and Russian media, this isn't a plausible explanation either. While it's true that the Trump administration did authorize an American company called Delta Crescent to restart oil production in the area, the terms of the agreement required that over 90% of all revenues return to Kurdish authorities, and the Biden administration refused to renew the company's sanctions waiver and banned US troops from assisting any private companies in the area. So, if it's not ISIS and it's not for oil, why does the US still have troops here? Well, the consensus amongst well-versed analysts seems to be Iran. Essentially, the US troops in the region are there to contain Iran and disrupt its support for its proxies, especially its proxy militias in Iraq. This is why they're so spread out across Iraq and Syria, to make it harder for Iran to create stable supply lines to its proxies, and also why there have been constant skirmishes between Iran-backed groups and US troops in the region. However, since Israel's invasion of Gaza, the frequency and intensity of these skirmishes has increased markedly, with something like 150 individual attacks. Wary of further escalation on Iraqi soil, earlier this month the Iraqi government started calling for a complete US withdrawal from Iraq, and on Thursday the US announced that they'd begun negotiating their withdrawal. At the same time, Foreign Policy reported that the US was considering withdrawing from Syria, presumably in part because Baghdad still acts as the main base for America's operations in Syria. However, after Sunday's events, a US withdrawal anytime soon looks deeply unlikely. On top of the 3 US personnel killed, at least 34 service members were injured in the attack at Tower 22, a military base in Jordan housing roughly 350 US Army and Air Force personnel. For context, under the 2022 US-Jordan Memorandum of Understanding on Strategic Partnership, the US is allowed to use Jordanian territory for military purposes in exchange for about $1.5 billion a year. Responsibility for the attack has since been claimed by a group of Iran-backed militias called the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, commonly known as the IRI, who claimed the attack was retaliation for Biden's support of Israel. The IRI also claimed to have simultaneously carried out a separate attack against US troops at the Al-Tanf base in Syria, but it's not clear this attack was successful. The attack in Jordan, however, is the first deadly strike against US personnel since the Israel-Hamas war erupted in October, and yet another worrying escalation in a war that has now expanded to involve at least 10 countries. So what happens next? Well, the US has already responded with more airstrikes against IRI facilities in Iraq, and as we mentioned in the intro, Biden has promised to respond. A US official described the attack as clearly an escalation of significance, and at the time of writing, 4 US senators have called for strikes in Iran itself, prompting Iran to raise its air defences to their highest readiness level. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that we're on the cusp of World War III, not least because Iran has gone to pains to distance itself from the attacks. On Monday morning, Iran's official news agency quoted Iran's permanent mission at the UN as saying, Iran has no connection to these attacks, and the clashes are between the US Army and resistance groups in the region, who reciprocally confront each other. Now, obviously, this should be taken with a massive pinch of salt, but it's worth noting that IRI are one of Iran's most independent proxies, so it's at least possible that they carried out the attacks by themselves. Similarly, the US has stressed that it doesn't want to get involved in a regional war, with Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff telling ABC News over the weekend that America's actions in the Middle East were intended as deterrents, and that we don't want to go down a path of greater escalation. Nevertheless, this is yet another reminder that, even if the US and other big players in the region don't want to get entangled in a regional conflict, unintentional escalation is often difficult to avoid. Things have only been moving in one direction for the past few months, despite the US's best efforts, and some sort of American-led escalation now looks inevitable. What makes all of this even more precarious is the fact that Israel's assault on Gaza shows no signs of slowing down, with Israeli officials recently admitting that they're a long way from defeating Hamas, and recurrent speculation of an Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon. Now, while you've been learning about US troops in the Middle East in this video, you might not realise that shady forces are working in the background to collect personal data from various sites and bundle it all together ready to sell on to a third party. Now, these data brokers can sell this bundle of information about you to anyone from a company to an online criminal. Now, while you might assume that you're safe online, perhaps you change your password regularly, or perhaps you're a hawk and always uncheck that little box that signs you up to annoying newsletters. Unfortunately, this doesn't completely save you. Companies that hold your data can still fall victim to a data breach, meaning that these data brokers can still compile information about you to sell on to others. Now, this is where our sponsor, Incogni, comes in. They reach out to these data brokers on your behalf, request that your data is removed, and deal with any problems that might arrive. In fact, they're tenacious and will put in multiple data removal requests even after your data's been removed to make sure that it doesn't go back on the market. So create an account with our link in the description, grant Incogni the ability to work on your behalf, and sit back as they make you safer. Plus, by using our link, you'll get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. Thanks for checking it out, and thanks for Incogni for sponsoring this video.